Hello everyone and a very warm welcome to the training video on Wheeling Transaction Model. The model is available for download on the ISMO website and it includes important notes to guide users on how to operate and navigate through its different sections. Let us now begin with a brief introduction on the Wheeling Transaction Model. The Wheeling Transaction Model is a tool developed by ISMO to provide its prospective users with an indicative analysis of supplier viability. This model takes into account the hourly imbalances between generation and demand using historical marginal prices as a reference. This model allows users to input three different demand profiles to represent various consumer patterns. On the generation side, users can enter three different generation profiles which may represent solar or wind generators. For the user convenience, this model also includes default generation profiles, one for a 50 megawatt wind generator and another for a 100 megawatt solar generator. For users who may not have hourly generation data available, these default profiles can easily be scaled to match the user's desired generator size. The model is built on fiscal year 2025 actual marginal prices, and users have the flexibility to apply day and night time sensitivities to these prices for scenario testing. Finally, in the dashboard, the user can select any demand and any generator profile. The dashboard also provides an option to enter the sale price. Based on these inputs, the model automatically calculates the sales margin for the supplier, taking into account the sale price, net supply costs, and any additional expenses such as ancillary charges. This concludes a brief introduction of the Wheeling transaction model. And before we begin, let's quickly go through the disclaimer section. The results and outputs of this model are provided strictly for informational and illustrative purposes only, and these results are estimates and should not be construed as accurate forecasts, guarantees, or commitments. The users are strongly advised to conduct their own independent analysis, verification, and due diligence before relying on any output. The calculations and figures are illustrative in nature and are not intended to be used as the sole basis for any regulatory, contractual, or commercial decisions. ISMO shall bear no responsibility, financial, or legal liability for any loss, damage, or consequences arising directly or indirectly from the use of this model or reliance on its results solely. This concludes the disclaimer section of the model, and in the next section, we will explain the structure of the training session. This concludes the disclaimer section of the model, and in the next section, we will explain the structure of the training session. This part gives a quick overview of how the model is organized and the steps we will follow. Step number 1 is the demand input, and in this step, we will learn how to input and structure different demand scenarios in the model. Step number 2 is the generation input part, and in this step, we will define and configure generator profiles based on solar or wind technologies. The third step, which is the final input step, is the marginal price. And in this step, we will apply hourly marginal prices and add sensitivities for analysis. The final part of this model is the dashboard, and in this step, we will view and interpret the results through the interactive dashboard. Now that we have reviewed the flow of this training module, we will formally begin the hands-on session on the Excel-based volume transaction model. So, before we start the training session, there is an important setting on the Excel file that needs to be done before we do anything on the model. So, in the options, please go to the Trust Center, go to Trust Center settings, and then scroll on to ActiveX settings, and please ensure that this setting of prompt is enabled or checked. Press OK, then again OK, then please save the file, and to enable these settings you have to restart the Excel again. So now let's begin our training session. Hello everyone. After the brief discussion, I will be taking you forward towards explaining the Excel model. We will be starting the model with step 1, which is a step in which the user is allowed to input several demand scenarios. So, in this step, first table is the important notes table. In this table, a brief description of how the user will be using the sheet is already listed. And the inputs and outputs of each of the tables within this sheet are explained in detail. So, moving forward towards the table of contents. In the step 1 input demand, we have total 6 tables starting from table 1.1 in which the user will input the demand data such as the peak demand in megawatts. In table 1.2, based on the input demand data, the minimum installed capacity as per the technology by the definition of firm capacity is automatically calculated. From table 1.3 to 1.5, the user will enter the hourly demand data for base case in table 1.3, for scenario 1 in table 1.4, and for scenario 2 in table 1.5. Finally, in table 1.6, the demand that has been input in 1.3 to 1.5 is converted into annual demand profile, which will be used in the model calculations. So, now we will start with table 1.1. Table 1.1 is the table in which the user inputs the demand data, or I would say the demand configuration data. So we have in column number 1, we have 3 options: base case, scenario 1 and scenario 2. For the 3 cases, the user will enter the peak demand in megawatt in column P, and in the next column of input hourly demand, it is basically linked to the 3 other tables, table 1.3, 1.4 and 1.5, where the user will be entering the hourly demand for each case. For example, base case in table 1.3, scenario 1 in table 1.4 and scenario 2 in table 1.5. Once the user enters the demand in these tables, the load factor is automatically calculated. Another thing I would like to mention here is, if you click on the load factor, it gives you an input message that if the load factor is greater than 100%, it will issue you a warning and the user is not allowed to move forward with the model until it enters a demand profile which has a load factor of less than 100%. So once the data input is completed in table 1.1, the table 1.2 will automatically calculate the minimum installed capacity by technology based on the peak demand which is input in table 1.1. For example, if I enter 10 megawatt peak demand in table 1.1, table 1.2 will automatically calculate the solar minimum installed capacity and the wind minimum installed capacity. Okay, so once table 1.2 is filled, we will now move. So after table 1.2, we will now move towards table 1.3. The user can just click on table 1.3 and it will automatically move towards the table. So here the user will input the demand data for the base case, and if you see, the table is designed such that for each month the user can enter up to 24 values, that is for each hour. For July up till June, all the data formats within this model is basically in the fiscal year format, so user will start from July and end will June. So for example, if I can move on to another Excel sheet where I have prepared the inputs, so the user will just copy the profile from here and paste it into the respective demand case. So once the hourly data is entered in the base case table 1.3, we can now move forward towards table 1.4. In table 1.4, the user can enter the demand in the similar way for the scenario 1. So I have prepared the input sheet for the demand profiles, so I will just copy the data and paste it on the model table 1.4. Similarly, I will now move forward towards table 1.5 and enter the data in the similar way from my input sheet. You can prepare a similar input sheet based on the model inputs so that demand can be entered into the model easily. So here in this case, I have entered 3 types of demand. One in base case, which is a flat 10 megawatt demand. In the second table, I have, for the purpose of analysis, I have removed the demand from the night hours, let's say from 2 to 6. And in the next table for the scenario 2, I have removed the demand from 0 to 6 hours and later on from 18 to 23 hours. So in this way, I have 3 demand profiles which I can use in the dashboard to analyze different scenarios. So once the demand is entered in each of the three tables, in table 1.3, table 1.4 and table 1.5, then in table 1.6, these monthly demands are automatically converted into hourly profiles over the air. So for the base case, now we have 8760 values of demand in scenario 1 and scenario 2 also. So in this way, our inputs in the demand sheet are completed, and we now have three demand profiles of 8760 values, which we can use in the dashboard to analyze along with different generators. So now moving on towards our step number 2, which is the input generator profile data. Just like in step number 1, we have important nodes table in this sheet as well. This important nodes table basically describes how the user will input the data in each of the tables that are present in this sheet. So we will start with table of contents. Here you can see we have three tables. Table 2.1, in which the user enters the input generator data. In table 2.2, there are default generator profiles, which I will explain later on, that what is meant by default generator profiles and how they are being used in this model. Table 2.3 is the user input generator profiles table, where the user is allowed to enter their own generator profiles and use it in the model. Now let's move on towards the explanation of table 2.1. In table 2.1, the user has the option of using 5 generators to analyze against 3 different demand profiles. Here we have generator 1 and generator 2, which are default generators. In this case, generator 1 is by default a wind generator and generator 2 is by default a solar generator. So generator 1 is basically a typical 50 megawatt wind generator which is located in Jimpeer, and generator 2 is basically a 100 megawatt solar generator which is located in Sindh region. So we have used their profiles as default profiles. For example, generator 1 profile is by default a profile of a typical 50 megawatt wind power plant in Jimpeer, and generator 2 wind profile is basically a typical profile of a 100 megawatt solar power plant located in Sindh region. So the next parameter is the minimum installed capacity, which is already automatically calculated in step number 1. So in this case, for a 10 megawatt peak demand, it has automatically calculated that the minimum installed capacity for a wind generator is 22 megawatt, and minimum installed capacity in case of solar only is 45 megawatt. So in the next tab, we have the option to input the enter installed capacity. Here the user will be entering the installed capacity of the generator it is intending to use in the model. For example, if the user intends to use a wind generator of 30 megawatt, then whenever it enters 30 megawatts here, the profile of that wind generator, which is originally of 50 megawatt, will be scaled to 30 megawatt. So whenever a user enters a value in this cell and in this cell, the profile will be automatically scaled according to the installed capacity entered by the user. In this case, the 50 megawatt wind plant profile is scaled to 30 megawatt, and if I enter a value here, the profile of a 100 megawatt solar is scaled to 50 megawatt automatically. So the enter installed capacity tab allows the user to enter the installed capacity of the generator which it wants to use in the model. Okay, so the next tab is the enter generation cost. In this tab, the user will enter the annualized total generation cost of the generator in billion rupees. In the next tab of generation, the generation will be automatically calculated once the user inputs the profile. But for generator 1 and generator 2, since we are using the default profiles, so the generation will be automatically calculated and is scaled based upon the enter installed capacity. And the next tab is generation cost, which will be calculated once the user entered the cost in billion rupees. In this case, if I enter the cost in billion rupees here, the cost in rupees per kilowatt hour will be automatically calculated, and if I do the same for generator 2, its rupees per kilowatt hour cost will also be calculated. In this way, we have completed the configuration of the two default generators, generator 1 and generator 2, and now let's move forward towards the explanation of generator 3, 4 and generator 5. In these three generators, the user will have the option to enter their own generator configuration data. For example, if I select generator 3 and select the solar option, the minimum installed capacity that will be required based on the input demand will be automatically displayed here. So if I am willing to install a 50 megawatt generator, then I will enter the installed capacity here, and in the next step I will enter the generation cost in billion rupees. Similarly, in the next step, the generation in gigawatt hours is currently displayed as 0 because the user will have to enter the profile of generator 3. The profile of generator 3 will be entered in table 2.3, which I will be showing later on. In the next step, the generation cost in rupees per kilowatt hour will be calculated once the user add the generation profile in table 2.3. Similarly, the user can add another generator in generator 4 and another generator in generator 5. So, this concludes the explanation of table 2.1, and now let's move forward towards table 2.2. As I have explained earlier, table 2.2 is basically the table in which the default profiles of generator 1 and generator 2 are located. These default profiles are scaled based on the input installed capacity in table 2.1. For example, in table 2.1, I have entered the installed capacity as 30 megawatt. So, in table 2.2, in this column, the 50 megawatt default profile of generator 1 is scaled to 30 megawatt for every hour. Similar is the case for generator 2, in which I have entered the installed capacity as 50 megawatt in table 2.1. So, as I have already explained, this generation 2 represents a 100 megawatt solar located in Sin. So this profile will also be scaled according to the installed capacity entered in table 2.1, which in this case is 50 megawatt. So after table 2.2, let's move forward towards table 2.3. Table 2.3 is the table in which the user will input the generation profiles of generator 3, generator 4 and generator 5. In this case, we have selected generator 3 as a solar power plant, so it will be displayed here as generation 3 solar, and the user will have to input the generation profile of generation 3 solar. That will be an annual profile, and the data will correspond to 8760 values. So in this case, I have already prepared an input generator profile, which I will just copy and paste. So once the generation profile is entered, we will now go back towards table 2.1 and see the sum of generation will be automatically calculated, and the generation cost in rupees per kilowatt hour will also be calculated. So in this case, we have completed the configuration of generator 3, which is a user input generator. And that also concludes the explanation of step number 2, which is the input generator profile. So now we will move forward towards our next step, which is the input marginal price. So, just like the other two steps, the first table is of important notes, which will explain the user how to use this sheet. Now let's move on towards table of contents. Here we have three tables. Table 3.1, which is the actual hourly marginal price of fiscal year 2025. In table 3.2, this is the table where the user has the option to enter the hourly sensitivity between the day and night. And I will explain it later that how to use this sheet. So the table 3.3 is the final table, which will be adjusted accordingly for the sensitivity, and this table will be used in the model for calculations. So now let's move on towards table 3.1. Here you can see that this is the table where the actual hourly marginal price of fiscal year 2025 is present. And now table 3.2 is one of the main tables. Here the user has the option to enter sensitivity against each hour. For example, let's say if I enter 5% here, or if I enter minus 5% here, then the marginal price of that hour for every hour in this actual marginal price table will be decreased by 5%. So in this way, I can select or add sensitivities for day and night hours into the actual marginal price. We can do the sensitivity for day and night hours in the marginal price by using table 3.2, and the resultant table is the table 3.3, which is the final marginal price table, and this table is basically used in the model for calculations. So after the table 3.3, the next step is dashboard. But before going into the dashboard, let's just summarize what we have done up till now. In table 1.1, we have entered the demand data, and in the respective tables 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, we have entered the hourly demand profiles by month, which is converted into annual profile in table 1.6. And then in step 2, we have three tables, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. In 2.1, we have entered the generator data. Generator 1 and generator 2 are the default generators. Generator 3 to generator 5 are basically generators which will be added by the user, and the respective profiles are available in table 2.2 and in table 2.3. In step 3, we have seen that we have the actual marginal price data of fiscal year 2025. We can do the sensitivity through table 3.2, and then the revised table or final table is available in 3.3 for the final marginal price. So with table 3.3, we have concluded the input side of the model, and now let's move on towards the dashboard. So dashboard is basically the sheet where user can select between the demand scenarios and generation profiles which are input in step 1 and in step 2 and see the results accordingly. For example, in demand scenario, we have the option to select between the three demand cases: base case, scenario 1 and scenario 2. By default, it is base case. So the peak demand that was input is 10 megawatt. The demand profile that was entered for base case has a load factor of 100%, and the demand energy calculated to be is 87.6 gigawatt hours. So for example, if I want to change the case to scenario 1, then the user will simply select the scenario 1 from the drop down menu, and the dashboard or the model will automatically takes into account scenario 1 for the consideration. So similarly, for the generator, we have total 5 generator options, but only 3 are visible here because we have 2 default generators and 1 generator is input by the user. For the remaining 2, since there was no data input, so they are not visible here. So for example, if I select generator 2 solar, then the model will analyze the demand scenario 1 with generator 2 solar, as can be seen in this chart of demand versus generation. So in this way, the user has the option to keep the demand scenario same and analyze it for different types of generator profiles. For example, if I keep the base case constant and analyze between generator 1, generator 2 and generator 3, then I can see the results and do the analysis based on 3 different generator profiles. Similarly, I can do it with other demand scenarios, scenario 1 or scenario 2. So in this way, the user can select between the demand scenario and the generator which it intends to use for the model calculations. So for the purpose of training, we have considered generator 1 wind and we are analyzing it with demand scenario which is base case. So after selecting the demand scenario and the generator, we now move forward towards the marginal price. So after selecting the demand case and generator, the marginal price tab basically displays the maximum, minimum and average value of marginal price in our data set. For example, after applying the sensitivity, this is the maximum marginal price in our data set, which is 36.21 in this case. This is the minimum marginal price, which is 3.07. Now let's move on to the next section, which is for imbalances. Here we have imbalance in terms of gigawatt hours and in terms of billion rupees. So in this section, we have imbalance purchase and imbalance selling and the net imbalance. Imbalance purchase here represents that, for example, if in an hour the demand exceeds the generation, then the deficit between demand and generation, which is purchased from the grid, is calculated for every hour, and then the sum of those purchases is represented here. So 33.48 is the sum of energy that is purchased from a grid in case of deficit. Now moving on to selling. Selling here represents that, for example, in an hour, if generation exceeds demand, then the excess energy for every hour of such year is being calculated, which corresponds to 33.35 in this case. Net imbalance represents the difference between selling and purchasing. So in this case, we have a negative imbalance of 0.13 gigawatt hours. Okay. In terms of billion rupees, purchase represents that for every such hour when demand exceeds the generation and we purchase some amount from the grid, the same amount is then multiplied by the marginal price and the value that is being calculated for that hour. And when we sum all those hours for the year, the total is represented here, which in this case is 0.55 billion rupees. And in case of selling, when the generation exceeds the demand and we have excess energy, then the same is being sold to the grid on marginal price and the sum of every such hour is being represented here. So as you can see that in case of energy we have a negative imbalance, but in terms of billion rupees we have a positive imbalance of 0.06 billion rupees. So now moving on towards the per unit imbalance, which is in rupees per kilowatt hour. In case of purchase, the per unit amount is calculated by dividing the imbalance purchase in billion rupees with the balance energy. And same is the case for imbalance selling. So here we have the per unit price in case of purchase, which is around 16.56 rupees per kilowatt hour, and in case of selling we have 18.38 rupees per kilowatt hour. So now moving on towards the per unit imbalance, which is in rupees per kilowatt hour. In case of purchase, the per unit amount is calculated by dividing the imbalance purchase in billion rupees with the balance energy. And same is the case for imbalance selling. So here we have the per unit price in case of purchase, which is around 16.56 rupees per kilowatt hour, and in case of selling we have 18.38 rupees per kilowatt hour. Moving on towards our next section, which is the net supply cost, and this is one of the crucial segments of this dashboard. Here we will be calculating the imbalance cost and the generation cost to supply and the net supply cost. So starting with imbalance cost is basically calculated by dividing the total net imbalance, which is calculated in this section. In this case it is 0.06 billion rupees. It is then divided by the units that is supplied to demand. For example, in this case it is 87.60 hours. So the net supply cost in this case will be 0.06 divided by whatever the units we have delivered to demand. Similar is the case for generation cost. So for generation cost, we have used the generation cost which is input by the user in step number 2. For example, we have it. In this case, we have the generation cost as 0.8 billion rupees, and when we divide it with the demand supplied, that is 87.60 gigawatt hours, then we get the net generation cost to supply, which in this case is calculated to be 9.13 rupees per kilowatt hour. So the net supply cost is then calculated by subtracting the generation cost with the imbalance cost. In this case, it is calculated to be 8.46 rupees per kilowatt hour. This cost represents the net supply cost in this case. So once the net supply cost is calculated, let's move on to the sale price. For example, if he wants a contract in which the sale price is 30 rupees, he can enter here 30 and the model will use 30 rupees. So he can enter here basically any value based on his own analysis, and the model will use this to calculate the net sale margin. The next portion is for the wheeling charge. Wheeling charge by default is 12.55 rupees. However, user has the option to vary this as well in order to do the analysis. So net sale rate is basically the difference between the sale price and the wheeling charges. In this case, the net sale rate at a sale price of 30 rupees is 17.45 rupees per kilowatt hour. So finally, in the last section, which is the results or output section, we have the net sale rate, which is 17.45. We have the net supply cost, which is 8.46 in this case. Other costs, which may include the cost due to ancillary services or any other cost which is envisaged by the user, we have taken it as 1.5 rupees per kilowatt hour. The sale margin available in rupees per kilowatt hour is basically calculated by adding the net supply cost into other cost and then subtracting it from net sale rate. So the sale margin available in this scenario, in which we have considered a flat profile of 10 megawatt and analyzed it with a wind generator of 30 megawatt, it is calculated to be 7.49 rupees per kilowatt hour. It is representing that After deducting wheeling charges from the sale price, which is 30 rupees in this case, and incorporating the impacts of imbalances and generation or any other cost, the sale margin that is available to the supplier is 7.49 rupees per kilowatt hour, which the supplier can use to develop their own business cases. With this, we have concluded the training module, and thank you so much for watching this video. And in case of any query or feedback, please feel free to reach out to the ISMO team for further assistance. Thank you.